We're live! We're live. Welcome to this interview brought to you by Säkerhetspodcasten and SecT. This is the part where Säkerhetspodcasten does some interviews with a few of the speakers, and this is run in the while you're having breaks in the videos during the talk.
This is what we do.
So awesome. We now have Mike, and your last name I didn't catch it.
Goedeker.
Goedeker, yeah. Also known as
Idiot
on Twitter. And you just delivered an awesome talk on threat intelligence and risk intelligence.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, super interesting. And like Jesper said in the stairs up here, it sounded like you were leaving out some information, perhaps, or sort of letting the audience draw the conclusions.
Yeah.
But your points were pretty obvious, I think.
So for those who haven't seen the talk, you're actually able to do it because it's going to be online on the SecT's YouTube channel. So just to dig in,
but before we start talking about your talk and your the work that has gone into it, we just for protocol we have a few questions.
Yes, sure,
I have a few questions.
Cool.
So how did you start in security? How did you get started in security?
In the industry was years later, but I actually started working with computers when I was in the 6th grade. And back then in the States, it was normal for us to take computer courses, that kind of stuff. And I kind of started off with those computers with the Apple I, Apple II, Commodore, the whole 9 yards, Sinclair, and all those different older systems. Yeah. And then I started as an administrator. Back then we thought it was cool because it was really cool. You got to stay in this huge room with a big Sperry system, Unix System 5, and you had air conditioning and you were the guy, right? Yeah. So I guess I'm one of the older generation guys that that actually live the correct title of hacker. In this instance, a person who likes to understand technology, takes it apart, and tries to make things better.
Yeah, cool. So in your opinion, you were referencing hacker. What's the coolest hack in history?
Oh, what's the coolest hack? There's so many of them. I mean, it all started off with a lot of the phone boxes with the frequencies, Captain Crunch and that stuff. Crunch, yeah. I mean, and then back in the days when the first viruses came out, I believe one of the more well-known ones came from Pakistan. Yeah. Back then it was, excuse my French, shits and giggles, because you had these viruses that would either delete your hard drive or they would display something on the screen, and they were cute. Nowadays, a lot of the stuff morphs into stuff where they're typically organized groups and or nation states that use this type of technology to basically capture information they shouldn't really have a right to capture. So
right. So that sort of brings us into the subject of your talk today. It was very interesting to follow your work through threat intelligence and risk intelligence and making a point out of not mixing the two together.
Right, exactly.
Can we go into that? Can we have your definition about threat intelligence versus the risk intelligence?
Right.
So what's the difference in your opinion?
So I would tend to be more in line with an ISO definition of that. So risk intelligence basically is a nomer from risk management, and there's ISO definitions for that. Risk management for me, or risk intelligence, is a factor time. It's also information that's typically unstructured. It's information about things that can turn into threats, and threats then leverage exploits to do a certain thing, shape or form. So threats are also time sensitive. Threats are basically things that are happening in near real time or in real time. They leverage exploits, and they then do the damage that they're supposed to do. The difficulty with risk intelligence, I think, in my mind, is that risks are a lot more difficult to find because you're trying to predict something before it actually happens. Yeah. And a threat is something that's happening The difficulty with that is while you're looking at a threat and trying to patch your systems, trying to close down the attacks, you don't typically have the time that you need in order to learn from what's actually happening.
Or actually analyze.
Right.
You need to mitigate.
Yeah, right. And if you look at some of the things like the standards out there, ISF's IRAM, that kind of stuff that leverage risk management, some of the lessons learned there is if you try to gain back some time by predicting something before it happens, you can collect more evidence and more data and learn from it. And right now, I personally don't get the feeling that we're learning from the things that we call threat intelligence.
No, yeah.
You know, and,
could argue that, maybe, yeah.
Maybe right or wrong, but that's my view on it. I mean, I tend to focus more on risk intelligence, which is, more difficult and a lot more data you need to collect. But I believe in something called proactive security methodology. And that's something that I developed a while back after seeing all these different implementations and coming to the conclusion that if you have a SIEM, an IDS, or a security system that logs log management, events, etc., and it doesn't provide a value in regards to being proactive, then you need to question the value of that system.
Yeah.
Right.
And that kind of snake oil is actually pretty common nowadays, that people, they buy their SOC function and it's more or less a giant pipe of data that nobody actually gets any business value out of.
Yep.
They create a lot of IOCs, but nobody, what is the actual meaning of this definition that we spent millions of kroners or dollars or euros creating? Do you agree with that? I think it's
IOCs
efficient.
IOCs, indicators of compromise, the pros and cons with that is obviously the cons are you need an attack to happen. If an attack happens...
And you need to actually classify it as an attack. You need to actually know what's going on.
Which is interpretation. And then it always depends on who's interpreting what, what are their filters, how do they understand and comprehend things, etc. So when you're talking about stuff like that, you have a certain amount of subjectivity that you need, or objectivity, and you have people that interpret that with their own interpretation of what an event actually means. If you take yourself out of that situation and you use something like mathematics, it's a neutral thing. So you configure something like a classifier that says, okay, well, this defines that type of event, this defines that type of thing. And you let the evidence...
But let's say like in the WannaCry example, we were exploiting SMB. That's like generic traffic for almost like a lot of enterprises. So how mathematically will that work for you then? Because then you have legitimate traffic that actually utilizes the same protocol, acts in the same way, not entirely in the same way, because we will have this $sign random stuff that is actually... So, okay, that maybe will be a prediction, or like, let's say, that will be a factor for your mathematics, like this given this and this and this.
Right.
Okay, then it needs to be this.
Right. I would tend to focus on if you see traffic and it's connecting to something outside of your network, then the first question is why is that happening?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And then if it's trying to connect to something outside of your network and it's pushing out data that could be considered confidential, then that would be an even more important question to ask yourself. So I try not to focus on the facts that we have protocols and operating systems are not always configured correctly, but I tend I try to focus in more narrow details as to, well, if a connection's happening, then why is it happening? Is it legitimate or not? Or for instance, if I'm connecting to Akamai or to NTT data or anything else, those are servers that are used for patch management. And if you remember, I think it was 2 years ago in Black Hat, there was a discussion about using and hiding attacks in legitimate traffic. So if you take a look at that, you have your firewall configured for a certain thing, it's patch management. But then what I say is, I understand it, it's more difficult, but then why not do the following? Try to narrow down your patch management traffic in a certain time zone or in a window.
You limit, in this... Given this time frame, this is legitimized, or otherwise it's not. Okay, that's valid.
It's not a single, it's not going to be a solution to the actual problem, because then if you're interesting enough for a threat actor or a nation state, they'll try to find that out and then they'll mimic that. So I mean, there's certain things you can try to do, but at the end of the day, there's no such thing as 100% security.
No, not at all.
But I was thinking about one thing. I mean, going back to the difference between threat intelligence and risk intelligence. I mean, risk intelligence, isn't that building on post threat intelligence? Because you're looking at attacks that have occurred in other countries and so on and so forth, like with black energy and the elections and so on, and you're picking up on some of those indicators of something as bad as going down.
Yeah,
and that is sort of, you need to raise your awareness here and be on the lookout for this, because there's a big chance that something bad is about to happen.
Right. So I would say, first off, very good point. Yes, I agree to an extent. We're always going to be using history and historical attack data in order to learn from that historic attack data. More often than not, if we're looking at risks, we'll have historic data, and then we'll try to predict if something new can happen.
Yeah.
So you always are going to have a mixture. And if you take a look at risk management says that a risk is A, could lead to threats A, B, C, D, E, and F.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have the indicators of compromise, etc. The only thing I'm saying is if you have the factor time and you try to be predictive, proactive, then you have more of an option, an opportunity to collect information that will help you defend against that attack in the future, right? So what I'm basically saying is, we've done a lot of work on starting to collect log management and that kind of stuff, but we maybe not have done as good a job as we can do in being more proactive and defensive. Right?
No, I agree with that.
Right. The second thing is about risk intelligence means that I'm asking people, so why don't we just use a lot of the same offensive techniques in order to use that as defense?
Yeah.
So if we don't learn from an attack, if we don't know people are using Kali, or if we don't know that they're using DDoS attacks or using specific Mirai, whatever it's going to be, then we're not really paying attention to the event. Right. So when you start getting into things like incident management, one of the things about incident management, according to NIST and other standards, is you build a knowledge base.
Yeah.
You build a knowledge base because you want to learn.
Yeah.
If you learn from something, then you can use that information to try to predict new things.
Yeah.
Right.
And that, in a sense, we don't do, I think, now in the industry.
Not enough, at least.
No, but it's more or less we build something that mitigate the exact vector in that exact system. So it leaves like no dynamic. It doesn't scale.
Right.
So that's a good point to argue, because I'm interested in your dynamic approach to this, because I find this area super interesting, because I do a lot of automating stuff, I do a lot of fuzzing, and it's not the same, but I have
it's similar. It's very similar.
I have the same problems that you need to generically and dynamically allocate certain stuff.
Right. So from a cool way of describing that. So in fuzzing, you also have a framework of things that help you speed up the process.
Yeah.
You still have analysis, which takes up 90 to 95% of your time. But if you use certain things in automation, which is what we do, then you can speed up that process so that you can invest more time actually finding something relevant.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, if we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, and we're not really that far yet as we could be, then why not use those concepts in a way, shape, or form to collect information, to learn from it, and then be proactive and defensive, really be defensive.
Yeah.
But that also means you need to learn about the attacks and the attack techniques and build that into the data collection process.
Yeah.
So I use things like DNS crawling, trying to find out if I can do a zone transfer, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Not because I'm malicious, I just want to make people aware of things like open source intel.
Yeah.
That's another thing. A lot of people talk about open source intel, but they don't really understand the concept of what that really means.
Yeah.
All these things, you can collect a whole bunch of information without ever touching a system.
Yeah.
As soon as you touch the system, then the antivirus and firewall, etc., triggers off.
Exactly. I mean, and you were in your talk, you were referencing Aaron's work, and that is basically that. I mean, taking public dumps of compromised systems and extracting intelligence information from that.
Right. Yeah. So Aaron and I, we worked together for a while, and I learned so much from him. So I do appreciate that. And this is just a small kudos to him again, to Phoenix. So when we were working on this, we had different objectives. My objective was originally to try to get a location for breaches, so that I could show people, okay, which countries are more prone to attacks than others. Yeah. So whereas he's collecting a lot more of the breach information, I'm only collecting a certain subset, which is basically the emails. And then I want to try to find out if I can get an IP for that email and then trace it back to a specific country. Now, there are pros and cons with that approach, but he does his stuff more comprehensively with the passwords, etc., which is a totally interesting field in and of itself. Like looking at the passwords, how can you predict who's going to take what password? That's scary. But that's, that's real. That's the stuff that we're trying to do. Me on more of the risk intelligence side, and Aaron more on the side of, showing people of what the fallacies in human beings and the passwords we create can lead to breaches, and that will all eventually be breached at some point.
Yeah, that's cool.
So when you, let's say in your subset, you just speak in generic terms, because this is a very large topic. I think we can talk we can talk about this forever, I guess.
Yeah.
But let's say when you, if you have it your way, the first thing you said, like email address, it's a good piece of valuable information. Then you crawl that one back. But let's say it is a Google, the MX is a Google. So the actual MX record is a Google from Google. Then it doesn't lead to something, right? Then do you crawl like, is it occurring in anything else, or how is like
really good question?
Method of crawling or like piecing the information?
There's I mean
like cache DNSs and
I mean DNS
dumpster diving, it's a good thing, right? Right.
So the email, to answer the email piece, I have to be careful because first off, I live in Germany. There's legal requirements and restrictions of what I can and cannot collect. Which is the reason why if I do collect passwords, I take them out of the initial dump, because my assumption is my system at some point will be compromised the more interesting it gets. No such thing as 100% security. So if I only have bits and pieces of information in separate systems, even if someone breaches into one, they won't get the entire data set. Right? So you need to actually think about creating a solution with the assumption that someone will eventually break your own system, which is kind of weird, but that's just the way it is, I guess. The second thing is with email crawling, it's a gray zone. What I try to do is I try to take a look at, without proactively digging a lot deeper, if I can get an IP for an email. It doesn't always work. I think roughly the set that I have of email accounts, breach accounts with passwords, maybe about 25 to 30% of that. And we're talking about 4.2 billion accounts that I currently have. They have around 30% of those in IP. So what I say to people is it's an indicator. It's not a single source of truth. And I caution people from ever looking at any solution that is a single source of truth, because it can't be. Even if we're looking mathematically at Bayesian algorithms, if we achieve 80%, we're really awesome.
That's good.
Most of the time, we're around 50 to maybe 60%. Right. So, but that's the thing that when you talk to some commercial companies, they don't tell you this.
No, not at all. It goes to 11. That's what they tell you. No, but another interesting fact is like command and control. You mentioned command and control infrastructures very briefly. How does that work? Do you have APIs to, let's say, Facebook and Twitter? We have seen a lot of like awesome command and control features with using like very broadly not uncensored, but broadly available big services like Facebook and
I'm a big fan of if there are APIs out there that are documented and are standard to build it into a solution. So it makes no sense to me when I say I'm building a proprietary system that will break after Twitter or Facebook or someone else changes their API, and they do it more often than not. So if I follow that standard approach, I may not get all the data, but I will get enough to make an assumption, right? The question is always, if your expectation is to get all the information, you will never be happy.
No, of course. There will always be like caveats, like there will always be...
Right. So we're talking about probabilities. So with that, I always have to understand that I will never have 100%. So I use the APIs. I have my own API. So my objective is when I collect this information, I want customers that have our subscription to be able to import that in their SIEM. So if I see a breached account, if I see an IP, you can automatically via JSON import that into your SIEM, and you can do a correlation. And I mean, these are the things when you work with SIEMs for like 20 years and you ask yourself, okay, well, where's the correlation? And there really isn't any.
Now, me as a security guy, it's like a good thing to not put all your eggs in one basket, because that API would be quite sweet to own or to break. So
I have another question, and it's regarding a subject that you barely touched on in your talk, and it's regarding attribution, the attribution game. You were making a point about the something being categorized as cybercrime. How can we know it's cybercrime? And also a very valid point that we actually talked about on one of our episodes of Säkerhetspodcasten, which is when someone releases something like Vault 7, what's the agenda behind that? Because there always is an agenda behind that.
Yeah, I mean, when I take a look at those releases, then I ask myself the question again: what is their agenda? What is the actual objective? What is the group behind that attack? And if if you don't really know for sure what the actual agenda is, then I'm very, very reluctant and very careful about the information. I mean, you obviously have to take a look at the dumps and try to interpret what are the requirements that you need to extrapolate from that dump to protect your customers. But it's something that's questionable for me. If I had to answer that or give you an answer, I would say I would trust more the smaller hacking groups that release information because they want people to be aware, rather than some dollar random mysterious Mr. X that no one really knows is behind them, that has something that can very quickly be seen as something political. So if a group like WikiLeaks and Julian Assange releases information, then I tend to not believe anything they say, because first off, the fact that they have servers in Russia, which no one really cares about. Second thing is that they've had really erratic and weird behavior in the last few years. And third off, the fact that Julian Assange threw a whole bunch of people under the bus just to save himself. I mean, I understand and appreciate that he's been in an embassy for such a long time, and I feel sorry for him. But in some other ways, I don't feel sorry for him, because judging him based on the actions he did before, it makes me think that he's not a consistent enough person to actually trust. No.
Shit happens when you party in Sweden.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Well, I mean,
you were here last night.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm very happily married. So.
Yeah. No, just a joke.
I'll admire the fact that people can party, and I'll have a beer and. Yeah. But.
Well, okay. To get back to the technology here. So you built your own solution. To do information gathering, to do.
Correlation
and like predict. Tell us a little bit more about that. How did that came to be? How did you saw the demand, of course, in like weak CMs or syslogs or SOC systems? That was
interesting.
And I can tell from your talk and from your talking about history and how this is open source mathematics, that you probably have some Bayesian math in there as well. Yeah, so Bayesian mathematics is what we use for the scored results. And I think right now that's probably one of the easiest ways to give results back in a scored fashion that is neutral. And that's one of the biggest issues when you take a look at some of these commercial services. Someone interprets something as something, you get that 50 or 150 page report, and you have to rely on them assessing a situation correctly. And in some of the events, like in Ukraine for fire sale, as well as the US elections, etc., you never really have all the information. So the assumptions that you make, you have to rely on something like forensic science or principles that are published, that are standard, that are step by step, so that if someone asks you a question, how do you come to that conclusion? You say, well, I did this, I did that, and I did that based on this, that, and that. And if it's a mathematics principle, you take the emotions out of it. And it's difficult. I'm not saying it's not difficult, but it's needed.
Well, it's easy to go down the forensic rabbit hole when you
exactly.
It differs of where you are and what you've done and in the previous, right?
We've both done some forensic work in the past, and it's super hard to stay objective, because you form a theory in your mind. And then you look for everything that will corroborate that theory or strengthen your arguments. But what you need to do is look at all the evidence and present even pieces of evidence that will throw your theory out of the room. So that's really important as a forensic scientist or forensic technician.
And the frustrating thing about that, and we all go through the same thing, is when you're right in the middle of trying to find out what an event actually means, you never have all the information. For instance, with fire sale, we had the last pieces of information that brought everything back together again 6 months after the event happened. And I mean, when you're in forensics and you're dealing with threats, you don't have that time. You got to come to a conclusion fairly quickly, and the conclusion can maybe be 50-50 based on the information that you've collected and have. And I mean, the better or worse log management is, the better or worse the triggers and the alerts in your SIEM are, the more of an indicator you'll have, right? And that's why that brought me to the conclusion of why I wanted to build that system that complements a SIEM. So I built this after doing consulting and working on projects, and I still do a lot of consulting and projects, because I think if you're not in the field and you're not experiencing this, any product that you create will be just unrealistic. It won't be close enough to the market. And I think that's an approach that I would hope a lot of startups that maybe listen to this would think about.
Yeah.
You know, it's not good enough to have some marketing stuff create a field, and then that field will give you a product that you have to develop. Yeah. You need to start on the ground first. You have to go through all the pain first, and then you'll understand why an analyst wants this or wants this or wants that. You know, I started off with risk intelligence, but then I talked to one of my customers like, hey, you know, Mike, it would be fantastic if you had the CVEs in there. It would be fantastic if you had trending, you know. So I built trending into the product. I got the CVEs, and you can see this stuff, you know. And they're like, oh, well, what about, you know, visualizing the data that you already have? And I'm like, okay, well, I've got the CNCs, I've got VPNs, I've got the Tor network, I've got about 500,000 IPs that I can track, and then I'll track that against the attacks that I see and see if there's any correlation. Yeah. And you know, lo and behold, you start seeing these correlations. You're like, you know, maybe this isn't as random as I thought it was.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Really, really interesting. And I can see that's actually, that gives something back to the client.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good approach. Because, the company I represent, we're kind of against the whole thing with the CM and SOC, because it's like, you need to actually be quite good at what you do, and you need to have, so this sort of limits that, because you actually, of course, you've done a lot of great work in your product, but you actually build it on stuff that is real, that is actually out there.
Right.
So that's a really nice thing, I think. It's like super interesting and a totally different approach.
Yeah, and it's also built from the perspective of an analyst and a forensics guy. So if you start digging into certain details, you make certain things very easy to get to. And then after you get the first subset of information, then you can use additional tools like, for instance, open source. I have OpenVAS built into it. Yeah. So if you want to take a look at an IP, you just plug the IP in, and then you can do your own vulnerability assessment. Mm-hmm. If I'm doing vulnerability assessments, then I already have the CVEs. Why not track that and show the trend analysis for that too? And it doesn't have to be a system that you pay 300,000, 400,000 euros a year for. That's BS.
Well, the funny thing is, if you actually look at all these, now I'm in deep waters, because a lot of industry guys will hate me, but if you sort of open the hood, God forbid you're allowed to open the hood, then there is not much to show for. There is a Splunk installation, there might be Snort, there might be pull pork above Snort, there might be some like man-made integration, but it's like almost always open source. Based.
99% of the time it's open source.
Yeah, and then they put something crappy above it, and now it's proprietary, and it's so fucking awesome, and everybody's like, it goes to 11, as I told you. Yeah. So I like this scheme that you're honest with. It's like, this is open source based. The thing we bring to our table is our know-how that we're sharing.
Yeah, so that's our IP.
That's what I sell, and I think that's like, because you're contributing to the whole. Yeah. It's not like you make money, of course, but it's not the sole purpose of making money.
I'd like to make some more money so I can pay for more of the cost, but
but of course, don't we all, right? But it is like a good standpoint. It's like I would feel good selling that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that you should say that, because I also built a version of my own firewalls. I started off with that as well, because I wanted to build sensors that were based off of open source with some of my own stuff on top that I thought would make sense. So I started with a derivative of PFSense, and then I created boxes that I said, okay, well, it can't cost more than like around 600 euros tops. Yeah. So 4 ports, 8 or 16 gigs of RAM with an SSD, and then I started playing around with that to figure out, is there a better way that you can work around all this stuff that is so expensive that a small and medium business could actually afford? Yeah. And that was the other thing. I figured, there's got to be a way to build a risk intelligence system that people can actually afford to pay for.
Yeah, I do agree. And now I use PFSense as well, for like my main firewall, and I do a lot of development there as well. And I've done a lot of OpenGL graphicking with like active PFSense logs. It's super nice, super over-engineered, but it's cool. There's flying stuff everywhere. But it's like, nowadays we can actually, as consumers and as prosumers, buy like pretty good hardware for not a lot of money, and then just implement a pfSense implementation in it, and we got like a really respectable piece of hardware that can do some real traffic analysis. And now, as you mentioned, with PCI Express or SSD ports, we have actually bandwidth on the actual device to do a lot of analysis there, and not like having to pipe it over to something else or
although with span ports, if you're doing that type of analysis, you do sometimes need filtering devices,
it
because
depends on traffic rate. So, but of course,
that was some of the interesting stuff that I did before this, because I worked for a company that sold application firewalls, and that's when you start, you dive into log management. That's when you get your experience with what works, what doesn't, and then when you literally work with telecommunications companies and billing systems, you're talking about databases that get entries, multiple thousands of entries a second. And the type of traffic that you're looking at, trying to pinpoint, okay, well, is a SQL query legitimate or not? When Aaron talked about the stuff about databases, I mean, he spoke from my heart. Because that's a lot of the places that I started to develop the plans for this, and then, how can we do this the right way? And I thought it was really cool,
Awesome. Well, I think we need to wrap up.
One more thing then, because you're super nice to be here. Now it's your shameless plug. Where do the guys or girls or the entities that are looking at this, where do they go to find more about your amazing work? Right.
So my website is https www.hackdevnet. So that's HAKDEFNET.com. My Twitter handle is @1D10T1. And if you want some more information, just contact me there. There's contact information on the website. And just don't try to attack the site. It's also a honeypot.
Sweet.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
For doing this.
Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And you guys listening, don't forget to go to Secti's YouTube channel and look at the talk, because it was awesome.
And don't forget to subscribe to Säkerhetspodcasten and listen to our podcast.
No, of course not. But you already know that, didn't you?
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Stopp videon också.
Okay.
Was that okay?